He leads the ML and Society team at Hugging Face. His work has had a large impact on a wide range of topics over the years, including governance of ML systems and governance of data sets, curation of web-scale data sets. He worked on the Hugging Face Transformers library, and of course, as a co-organizer of the BigScience Workshop last year. So please take it away, Yacine.
Before you do, quickly, I just also want to point out there's going to be lots of time for Q&A at the end of this. So Yacine will talk for a little while, and then be prepared to ask questions. This is interactive in that way. Thank you.
Sure. That all sounds good. Thanks a lot for a very kind introduction. I have like one pull request 3 years ago in the Transformers library, so that's the extent of my contribution to that. But I'll talk about the other stuff. Okay, so hi everybody. So I'm going to talk to you about BigScience, which for me has been a 2+ year journey with rich interactions and lots of lessons learned. I want to give credit to some of the people who worked on the slides that come to this deck. As I was telling Jesse, it has been such a big project with different aspects that we kind of share together different aspects. Do I have the right? There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of sections, and the first one is talking about the social experiment that was this value-grounded, open, collaborative research. Let's see. One of my slides is not happy, but that's fine. Okay, so the BigScience project was, depending on how you count, 2 years, 1 year, 1.5 year long. It was a project on researching large language models in the open. And it was made available in part by the availability of a compute grant. So we were lucky to be given access to about what would be $5 million in GPU hours on a French public infrastructures, which, as you know, is one of the requirements to training language models of the size of what we're seeing these days. So this technical ability served as a sort of catalyst to bring people together and look at different aspects of what research on large language models can mean, especially beyond just training a large language model. So I'm going to start from the end here of the project and starting for some of the most visible outcomes of the project. One is we ended up indeed training a large language model, which we called Bloom for BigScience Large Open Access, Open Collaboration, Open Science Multilingual model. It's either open access or open collaboration. And you can go look at the papers. There's a description of lots of things that went into training. That one has a little bit over 400 authors. So if you're curious, that's not the full set of participants in the project, but that's the number of people who we were able to trace contribution and ask if they wanted to be on the final paper. Obviously, all large language models are very much tied to their training corpora. We also wrote about the roots corpus, which is called responsible. There's still two opens. I never know which ones are which. None of them are open source because there are some interesting conversation about what's open and what's open source. But responsible, open access, open science, text. So again, the number of authors gives you a sense of what went into creating that corpus. Obviously, there's been lots of follow-up work, lots of work that has branched off. So I'm talking about, for example, BigBio here. Some people came into the project at some point, thought about what it would be like to use large language models for biomedical sciences, decided that there was a lot to do here that wasn't really tied to the main project. So they organized their own projects. And we had a few examples of that, which we thought was a really cool outcome of the project. Okay. So the name BigScience comes from that term BigScience that was going around to talk about large scientific collaborations. One example of which you might be familiar with is the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which is this huge collaboration around physics. So the idea was to have a value-driven training of a large language model. So this is kind of, you might be familiar with the concept of pre-registering that is tied to that. The idea is we want to say what values we want to embody this project, and then we'll try to stick to that and use those to guide our choices. So we had some motivations that had to do with that. First, we saw that large language models that were available had a huge lack of linguistic diversity. It was mostly English and a couple of language organizations in Chinese at the time. There was little access to people to the whole development besides large industry lab. Much of the development was done entirely by machine learning scientists and machine learning engineers in the technical sense of the term, whereas those are socio-technical systems that engage a lot of society. And we wanted to really put those considerations as well as environmental considerations at the heart of the project. So here's a bit of a timeline of how things happen. The project first started, it was first an idea that was put together from the folks at GENC in France. So it's this national supercomputer, and they were expanding this supercomputer for science in general and wanted a good use case. And we thought that training a very large language model was a really good way to stress test an infrastructure like that. So we applied for a compute grant there. The grant was not only accepted, but led to more public investment into extending the cluster. And then from April 2021, when we had a public launch, when we started to invite people over, to July 2022, when the Blue model was fully trained, we had a very integrated collaboration on the Hugging Face language. Okay. So the values of the project were first driven by what we put in the grant requests. So we really focused on values of inclusivity, diversity, openness, and responsibility. And operationalizing those values meant looking at lots of different aspects of the model and of large language models, which we organized in like main areas. So there were 5 different working groups just for the data set, lots of working groups on evaluation, on modeling, some organization working groups, some working groups with expertise that were specifically legal or ethical, and all of those working together in this kind of asynchronous international way. One of the things that was really important for having that value-driven project was to think a little bit more about what those values meant and how they were implemented. So this is credit to Giada Pistilli, who led the ethical work of the aspect. So it was important to think about the intrinsic values, so things like diversity, reproducibility, or openness, which were the targets, and things like extrinsic values, which are kind of the things that you do to enable those values. So multilingualism is a tool of diversity and inclusion. Interdisciplinarity or accessibility, support reproducibility, and openness. So how did we organize that huge workshop? So we had all of the working groups that we talked about with a special role for working group chairs who were responsible both for setting the timelines of their own working groups and for coordinating across the working group chairs. We had tons of systems that supported asynchronous communication. So we tried to prioritize communication over Slack channels where people could refer back on their own time, Google Doc documents, trying to avoid too many live meetings or too many emails. One of the things that was really important was thinking about how we were building diversity. And that's something that's not necessarily apparent from the outside, but we were a little concerned at the beginning that just telling people we're doing this, join if you want, was going to limit to people who already knew you of our work or already had proximity to us. So we had a very intentional first month of reaching out to people who were acquaintances in different fields, or asking people who they knew who might be part of the project, and trying to really be intentional about building that diversity geographically and from a disciplinary perspective. So this led to lots of outcomes that are not necessarily what people think about when we think about research of large language model. So we've had new kinds of licenses, new kinds of documentation about the regulatory framework of large-scale machine learning and large language models, and all of that to support our work and ground it more broadly in society. Okay, so all of that corresponds to nearly 1,300 people registered. Of those, as I mentioned, we had about 400 people where we know exactly what they contributed, but lots of other people were involved in discussions in shaping the projects in various ways. Tons of Slack channels, which was a little overwhelming for all of us who were organizing. and people from different institutions, different countries with different backgrounds. There were about 20 papers as of October 2022, but people have written much more since then. And lots of hackathons, which was one way that we got people to work together a bit more directly. Okay, so that's the project in its entirety. I was personally data area chair, which meant that I focused on the following working groups. So all of the data working groups, the organization working groups, and the ethical and legal working groups. So in order to get people a sense of how this worked in practice, I thought it would be worth focusing a little bit more on the work of those working groups. So we had this ethical charter, right, where we said that the idea of the project was to implement specific values, including inclusivity, diversity, reproducibility, openness, and responsibility. So one of the things about having values for a project like that is that it's useful to have this kind of central document. But whenever you're going to go into a specific aspect, whether it's going to be the technical aspect or the data aspect, you're going to be working with different externalities, different stakeholders, and the general formulation of the value might not correspond to the work that you're doing day to day. In particular, what things we had to reckon with for the data side specifically was what the value of openness meant. And one of really the driving ideas here was that we didn't equate inclusivity and reproducibility of the science to making all of the data that we use fully open and fully distributable. There's been some good writing about how this can exclude people who have different stakes around their data, who want to keep more control of their data. So that was kind of thinking in practice, how can we have something that's both good science and reproducible science, but think about more intentional governance of who's going to look at the data, have access to the data, and be able to reproduce the data. A lot of that thinking started with taking stuff of the stakeholders for our data efforts. Obviously, this was something multilingual project, so different language communities defined in different ways. Language speakers were stakeholders, their data is included. People who are going to develop and train a model based on the data set are stakeholders. They have their own needs about the data that we can find. And you can look at the full list. I'll add links to the paper at the end. But that was this first approach of thinking who's involved, who should be involved, and who should we think about when making decisions about data. So this led us to a slightly different list of values for the data working groups than we had for the overall project. You can find them there, but I think of particular notice are the value of privacy in the context of regulations that are coming up, such as the GDPR, such as privacy regulations in the US, in Canada, and in other places. Values of consent, people choosing whether data that they created should be included or not, regardless of whether it has private information. And then things around just rewards, licensing, attribution, thinking about not necessarily from the length of copyright, although that is a concern, how people are rewarded for their work and how it's used in technology. Two other really important values here that's actually really shaped how we did things were values of participation and local knowledge, which is to say, for example, when talking about a language, we want language speakers to be making the final decisions. Okay. So all of that goes under that area of data governance. So data governance combines ideas from ethics, ideas from regulation, ideas from community governance, how we get people's inputs, how we get people to interact with the products. We are more familiar with aspects of governance that have to do with documentation, but that's also something that's really important. Documenting a very, very large scale data set, seeing how to make that meaningful, how to make that easy to interact with. Obviously, we weren't coming up with all of the notions by ourselves. There's a lot of amazing work being done on data governance. So I wanted to give a shout out to some of our partners, some of the people that we talked to. A special shout out to Strathmore University in Kenya that has been doing a lot of work about looking at what privacy law looks like in the African context, because we didn't want to have something that only targeted regulation and values in the US and in Europe. So in order to operationalize those values a little bit, one thing that was really important is thinking about who has an active role in making choices surrounding data. So we start with data hosts and data providers. So data providers are going to be the people who own the data. So that can be a publisher, that can be a radio institution, that can be someone who writes on the internet. Data hosts are going to be the institutions that collate those data and make decisions for who gets to access them. So that can be AI2, for example, and you're one of the data hosts who we worked with in this structure. We had the role of data modelers, who are the people who are going to be making requirements of data sets and machine learning data sets that they want to find useful. We wanted to have something around data stewardship organization to connect all of those, and we did some of that, but there's still a lot to be investigated about how that can work. And we also had this notion of data helpers, which is how do we get data advocacy organizations into the mix? How do we get people who have ethical and legal expertise? And how do we connect them to those decisions and those technical decisions being made about creation of a data set? So again, I will direct you to the data governance paper that we wrote, kind of laying out those ideas. Bit of graphical representation of how they relate to each other. We wrote about it a lot more in that paper. Okay, so some of the big ideas there. We wanted to have governance structure that depended on the data custodians. So that's the data sources, the people creating the data, and the data hosts. I'm going to say a little bit more about how we got those and selected those data sources to begin with. But one thing that really drove a lot of our choices is that the data custodians and the people who own the data were really spread around the world in places that have lots of different values and lots of different regulations. We wanted to build technical tools to support some of the values that we mentioned. So for example, if you want to protect privacy, one thing we can do is private information redaction in text. As those of you who have worked with those questions may know, the tools to do that are less than perfect and less than ideal. So there was a lot of work in building those tools to enable the things that we wanted to do. So privacy protection, documentation, visualization. And we developed a lot of tools to that end that are all available online. I'll share the slides probably later, but there's links to a lot of those tools. One of those tools was inspired by Jesse's work on the C4 Explorer. So Ola put together a tool that lets people look at the data, including the data that we're not able to redistribute, and that allows people to not only search on the data, but will redact private information when it's presented. This is really important because it means that even data that is sensitive, that we cannot necessarily reshare, but that was important for training the model, people can still interrogate. They can still get a sense of what's represented in there and how that can inform model predictions. So on top of that, there were lots of efforts going on. I'm happy to talk more about it in QA. Some of the social and legal expertise that we had was through we were lucky to have lots of pro bono volunteer hours from lawyers who really engage with some of the questions of where regulation exists, where it doesn't exist yet, where it's heading, and how we can learn from even like regulatory trends to start thinking about how to implement and how to make choices. In particular, we published a playbook that covers across the 9 jurisdictions presented here, how regulation currently thinks about questions of privacy, intellectual property, licensing, data mining exceptions. So in the US, you'll be thinking about fair use. In the EU, you'll be thinking about the text data mining exceptions, and trying to get a sense of how that works and how that differs around the world. Cool. So that's kind of a lot of the things that went into data governance. Again, data governance was also a lot of negotiation, a lot of adaptation. We ended up with a system where we first came up with an agreement that we thought would help mediate direct relationships between data hosts and people who want to make their data available. In practice, it's very hard to put together a full data governance organization in under 2 years. So we ended up with something that was kind of a step in that direction, where we still give access to the full data set on a for research purposes, but we kind of do more case-by-case determination of how that works and whether that's necessary, and discussions about whether people are actually better served by looking at another data set if that's really what they need. So that's the thinking around governance. Another big question, especially for people who are creating data sets now, is how we identified sources that we wanted to have in the data set and how we got that to be something that was more of a collaborative process. So we wanted to choose to have a composite data set. So that's to say, we end up with a very large corpus that is made up of hopefully tons of components of small to medium size. The interest of doing that is that it's much easier to document if what you're documented is like 100th of your data set at a time that has specific properties. And it lets people promote diversity of the sources by looking at what sources you have included or not, and looking at like source level governance, because some of the sources might have different privacy needs or different processing needs. One thing that we really cared about was making sure that sources in a language were selected by people who have a strong connection to the language. Mostly we were asking for people who were first language speakers. In some of the cases, we relaxed the assumptions a little bit based on how high resource or lower resource the languages were. But we wanted to avoid some of the issues that we've seen in our field recently. So if you're not familiar, I really recommend the Data Quality at a Glance audit paper from Masakane, kind of making that point that if you say that you're going to do multilingual at scale by using automatic language identification, by working with languages that you do not personally know, then that leads to a lot of crap in your dataset. Okay, so we ended up with this like approach that relied on, we did use some common crawl data for different reasons. We talk about those trade-offs more in the papers, but we wanted something that was comparable to previous work. We did want a dataset that was big enough to justify the grant that had been given. But in the end, common crawl made up about, depending how you count, around 38% of the dataset. And then everything else were hand-curated sources that together added up to those 250 billion tokens and 1.5 terabytes of data in the languages that you can see here. We wanted to have a very low barrier to entry to selecting those sources, right? So the primary criterion here for being able to choose sources was familiarity with the language and with the language resource in that language. So a lot of effort went into building tools where people just had to go through a few clicks to share their knowledge of the metadata for those datasets, the privacy concerns for those datasets, why they were a good idea, and who were the dataset custodians. In order to, again, be intentional about the diversity, we organize a lot of collaborative events with local organizations that know what exists in their dataset. For example, Masakane was an amazing partner for languages in Africa. Machine Learning Tokyo helped us organize to get East Asian and Southeast Asian resources. Lots of organizations that work on their own regional languages, such as Basque or Catalan, and really targeting those collaborations, trying to have those events be multilingual so people could participate in their own language. And so we ended up with those datasets from all around the world, hopefully showing the kind of diversity that we wanted. Cool. I think I'm already running a little late, so I'm going to skip some of the information that we can have. Again, we'll share the slides, but we took a mixed approach to documenting the dataset. Some of it was people writing description of the sources. Some of it was looking at the statistics of the dataset. And you can find all of it in the NeurIPS paper we presented. Okay, so I'm going to quickly cover some more of the outcomes besides the data stuff. Obviously, the large language model, it's notable, and people don't always know that we train models of different sizes because we wanted people with different kinds of compute resources to be able to interact with the data sets. So there's the largest one that's 126 billion parameters, which was chosen to reflect what GPT-3 was. And then there's the whole range between 560 million parameters and that. There's a base model. There's also some instruction-tuned models, because by the time we were publishing our results, the public systems for GPT-3, which were getting a lot of attention, were mostly instruction-tuned in ways that we don't know about because they don't share the methods, but it was an important part of getting them to behave how people have come to expect. Cool. Spirits of openness, there's lots of demos. We are running the datasets for free for anyone who wants to try the demos and doesn't have necessarily the resources to look at them themselves. It can be really fun to play with it. We also ask people to report problematic behaviors and like help drive discussions around what works, what doesn't, and what our curation process wasn't enough to handle. One of the big outcomes of the project is a very extensive code base. There's code for training a large cluster. There's code for building a prompt data set to get that fine-tuning working. There's code for evaluation. There's code for visualization. And all of that is open source. Another one of the important outcomes is that we were extremely transparent about every single thing that was happening during training. I think that's very valuable. We tried to communicate about whenever there was a model divergence, whenever there was a bug, whenever there was something that other people might encounter if they tried to do something like that. We developed our own evaluation suites. To be honest, looking back, like this should have been its own effort again with as many people as we had for the whole project. But people did a lot of amazing work to evaluate different aspects. Extrinsic, so how it works on downstream tags. Intrinsic, so how the model behaves. Bias, social impact, generalization, and multilingual ability of the model. There was also some external evaluation of the model from the Stanford folks, so through Helm. This is like harder to interpret because Helm is only in English, but the general lessons is that even though the model was trained on less English data than the original GPT-3, its performance on downstream evaluations was on par with GPT-3, the original GPT-3. Again, not what was running by the time we finished the project. Lots and lots and lots of papers. You have lots of reading if you're interested in any aspects of those. And I really recommend them. Like a lot of them are really cover wide range. So here you have, for example, one on metadata sourcing specifically for Arabic text. And that was another cool thing that came out of the project that wasn't directly in the project. Lots of documented sources for people who are interested in Arabic NLP beyond the ones that we were able to use in the project. Okay, so very short overview of some of the trade-offs and the lessons learned, and then hopefully we can have lots of questions and answer lots of questions. There were lots of trade-offs that we knew that we were making. One was between having an ad hoc collaboration where people can just sign a form to join, and one where we had a legal entity. We chose against having a legal entity which corresponded to demands for people to be able to join without it being an issue with their primary job or without having to go through an intensive process. But it also meant that we had no proper funding, which came up as an issue a few times when we mostly wanted to pay people for their job and not requiring everybody to do volunteer labor, especially in cases of under-resourced languages. Another trade-off was how flexible we kept the whole project. We did not have a fixed timeline of how all of the pieces were going to fit together. It was good in some aspects because we had a project that was really reactive to feedback and reactive to things that were not going as we expected. On the other hand, it was a lot of communication overhead to keep things aligned. Okay, so looking back and giving you all my very personal appreciation of what worked and what was trickier, which again, that was a project with lots of organizers, so people have different takes. I'm really proud of what we achieved in terms of multidisciplinarity, different backgrounds participating in the research, geographical diversity of the participants and of the relevance of the data that we used. Very proud about the intentionality of targeting specific values, which meant that sometimes we took a hit on what we thought was going to be downstream performance for the sake of spending more time on kind of sticking to our values. One of the things that I will really stress is the importance of people and communication. And I know it sounds trite, but what worked best in terms of internal communication was when we hired people who acted as bridges, were involved in different efforts, and were able to translate the needs and the vocabulary used in different working groups. Another thing that I thought was really important was a lot of the concerns and the social concerns were surfaced by people who were directly affected. And that's not the perfect way to do this, and it still puts the onus on people to put themselves out there when they're already vulnerable. But we did have some important feedback, and it came through having a low barrier to entry, which means prioritizing having lots of people who are around the project and fewer people who know exactly what they're doing. All of that was really cool. I like that there's a lot of follow-up right now, like people after the end of the project took the model and adapted it to new languages. There's the Big Code project, which I'm happy to talk about more, that is taking a bit of a different approach, learning from some of the things that failed, but reproducing this value-driven approach and data governance and open participation. And there's been like follow-up on the legal work and the social impact work. Some of the things that were trickier, communication about the performance of the model was really tricky. Like you might have heard if you were aware of the problem of the project when we were releasing, lots of communication about like you spent all of that effort and your model isn't as good as GPT-3. And it's true that the system wasn't, right? Because people were interacting with GPT-3 as a commercial product that had a lot of bells and whistles and like the right generation parameters and like lots of instruction fine-tuning. But because like there's kind of this first mover advantage of people evaluating large language models now because of how they reflect things that GPT-3 does well, kind of tricky communication there. It was harder to put forward what had to do with governance and with the multilingual ability of the model. As I mentioned, coordinating, shifting goals, communicating through processes was really difficult because the collaboration went from like 20 people to 1,200 people within the space of 8 months, which means that project that worked 1 month didn't work the next. It was volunteer process, so sometimes there was volunteer drop, like people want to do something that's going to be a necessary step for other people to do their work, but the volunteers end up not being able to do it. So that was a bit hard to come into. We had a consensus-based internal governance mechanism with final decision power for some of the organizers. And consensus is hard, and it takes a lot of extra work, and sometimes it makes like making more time or working longer hours. And the lesson that I'm going to end up on is we kind of did the like academic conference organization where everybody's a volunteer and does their work on top of everything else. And that doesn't really work. I have a lot of appreciation from the full-time community managers and program managers we had. If I were to do it again, I would hire a few full-time community managers and program managers. Cool. I did not have time to put together a slide of links, but I will absolutely do that to share later.
Thank you so much for your talk. We're going to flip it over to Q&A. So feel free to type in the chat if you are remote, raise your hand if you want to use your voice, and let's get started with questions. I have some if no one else does right now. Does anyone want to hop in? No, I'll go. I've got pages of them. Can you talk the products produced, the 16 papers, the blogs are incredible sort of artifacts that you left behind. What would you say about documentation throughout the process? How did you handle it with 1,200 people?
Yeah, I'm not seeing who's speaking, so if you can introduce yourself.
It's Nicole in the room. It's Nicole in the room.
Oh, cool, okay.
I'm over here.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was a lot going on there. One thing that's quite interesting, I think, is that many of us spent a lot of time writing after the project had wound down, because we still remember what had happened, but there was just like lots to catch up on. People also came into that with different goals, right? Some people wanted academic papers that were published in conferences, and some people wanted technical reports and like daily logs of what they were doing. The best I can describe it was kind of a creative chaos where we ask everybody to write what they're doing in Google Docs, and then at some point someone comes in and tries to make it into a doc that's more accessible to other people or whenever. One thing that was really useful is we had regular events and full project check-ins. So the first one was the launch event at, I think, ACL 2021. And then at various conferences, we organized workshops, or we had all of those things where people were coming together. And that was a natural check-in point for people to put all of these things they had going all around into a unified documentation, slide deck, or one way to communicate it, not just for themselves, but for people who aren't as familiar with the project.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions?
Hey, Yacine. So this is a great talk, thanks. I am curious to hear a little bit more about the organizational structure. You've talked a little bit about that, but I think that's super important. And it's you raised a really great point, which is that the standard academic way of doing research around like individuals contributing and wanting to be attributed as like an author on a paper in a particular position, for example, it doesn't align directly with what needed to happen here. And so I like your final point on the slide, which is to hire full-time community managers and program managers. And I would like to hear a bit more about that. So like, I think each of the workflows had a lead, and then maybe there was like meetings between them. I'm not sure what the communication or
yes, great point. If I don't know if I can navigate easily on the thing, probably not. Okay, so we had different areas and different working group for per areas, and one working group that was charged with organization. And so it was people who were usually working group chairs of other working groups who met together and decided when we're going to have a project-wide event or how we were going to make sure that people were checking in. So some of the things I can talk about there was we did try to have sub-projects that were paper-sized, because that's why we had both of those things. We had like something where 5 people work together and they have a paper to show for it. And we had like the paper for each of the working groups that's going to have 30, 50, 200 people. And that's going to kind of direct people to all of the sub-efforts that happened. This was not efficient if the idea is to end up with a very good language model. The idea was to have a space for people to do research together. And there was kind of this like trying to pull and herd cats to like make sure that everything that those people are doing, all of the parts that can work together do work together. But again, that's like one thing I mentioned before, which is that there was this idea for the people who started the project that the project itself was the product, like showing a new way to do research. So different priorities than really like giving the best language model that people can use after, or giving the best data sets that will represent everything that we want it to represent. And we did have Susanna Illich and Violette Leclerc, who were community manager and program manager, respectively, and who worked like several full-time jobs each, making sure that people talked and deadlines were set and things moved forward.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in?
I had a question, as is Oyvind from the room. The sort of the type of data you talked about, which is the custodians wants it to be in the model, but they don't want to share it as a sort of a downloadable resource. Could you give some examples of that and sort of the somewhat awkwardness of, well, if this language model really memorizes it all, then you could get it back anyway, and so what kind of data is in that sort of awkward state,
So,
and how should we think about that?
Yeah, lots of things there. I guess like Jesse can talk to more than me to the semantic scholar part of it, since we used that data set and it was one of the ones that had licensing, okay, for research, but not for redistribution. Some of the other ones were newspapers. One of the things that was really amazing about this project was there was a lot of goodwill, which means that one thing that happened on several occasions was kind of handshake agreements. So, for example, we went to the CTO of Le Monde, which is a French newspaper, and we said, hey, we want to use this data with your consent. Can you give us the data? And they were like, we'll be fine if you crawl it yourself, just don't redistribute it. So we did that. Like, we crawled it, we added it in the data sets, and then if people want to see what data set we used to train the model, then they request access for that specific purpose. There were also different concerns that I can speak to with regards to the lower resource languages. Lots of collaborations from organizations. So there's the Viet AI organization that had their own data sets that they were happy for us to use to train the model, but that they didn't want to just reshare and have legal liability about.
Okay, thanks.
I see Jen has a hand raised.
Yeah, hi, Yacine. So nice to meet you. I've not been very responsive to your emails, and I'm apologizing publicly for that. So but let this be a new beginning. So interesting question. So the follow-up, the response from Le Monde and others were, yeah, you can use it, you can't redistribute it. But maybe to rephrase what I heard from Oyvind's question, the whole pickle with LLMs is that the output might be identical to the input. So how did you crack the no redistribution
Yes.
issue?
I'm sorry, like I thought of that when you asked the question. Thanks for bringing it back. We did a single training pass on the deduplicated data sets, which, according to all of the information and research that we had, strongly limited the ability for the model to memorize specific data points.
Thank you.
We mentioned that also. So we were in contact with, so I was talking about goodwill and handshake agreements. We were in contact throughout with the French Data Protection Authority. So the project started as a grant request from a European institution, which means that there needs to be a data management plan that includes a GDPR compliance plan. One of the things that we mentioned was the principle of data minimization that is featured in the GDPR. That aligns with what we've seen of people mentioning that their model performs best if they don't repeat training examples. But it's kind of this neat interaction of what's good scientific practice and what helps with regulatory compliance or pre-compliance for things that are still being decided. And yeah, I really encourage people to look for those opportunities to have things that are good practice across several dimensions.
Yacine, Luca here. I was wondering, when it comes to like coordination between the big overall working groups, right? Maybe everyone involved in the data with everyone involved in the modeling and benchmarking. I assume that there were like fundamental decisions that one side was pushing more for, and maybe at odds with like how specific working group and interpret the values charter that you had. Can you maybe give us examples of when that happened, if you can, and how you resolve that?
Absolutely. That's, I think, one of the most fascinating things about the project. We really wanted to have ethnographers on board, and we didn't do, I was talking about being intentional about diversity. That's something we weren't intentional enough about. One example was when the data set was supposed to be ready. People who wanted to train the model wanted the data set ready earlier. People who wanted to create the data set wanted more time, especially to be responsible about curation. The default there was discuss and compromise and find things that work until you have come to an agreement. And if you really can't come to an agreement after some extra leeway, then one of the people from the organization working group is going to make a decision for everyone. Removing pornography from the command crawl was a very contentious process. I will give huge kudos to the engineers who were working with filtering because they were very receptive to things, and they spent 2 weeks that they hadn't planned on trying to find for something that has higher precision and lower recall, which we really asked for as something that was a way to minimize the negative impacts of the filtering. But in that case, it's like we start with different priorities, and then we're saying, okay, so this is something where in order to resolve those priorities, we need extra work. And that's kind of what we want to prioritize extra work for.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, Jesse.
I also want to ask a bit about evaluation. So when I see these large language models being released, I think the initial intuition, the thing that people want is to compare them against each other. So when the newest language model is released, I think what we often do is look through, let's say, the associated paper and see if there are any tasks that model was evaluated on that previous models were also evaluated on. But it also seems to be the case that when most of these models are released, they're evaluated on some shared tasks, but some that aren't, and some that are, proprietary data or whatever. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about how you try to estimate the quality of one of these large language models, given that there's no perfect benchmark.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things going on there. One is in terms of coming to community agreements, we interacted with other community efforts. The BigScience evaluation harness was strongly inspired and reused a lot of code from the Illustrator evaluation harness, which again, is an open community. They try to build consensus, so that was helpful. We interacted with the folks working on Big Bench at the time to see how much of that we could reuse. So that's the thing that we can do. The thing that we cannot do is there hadn't been evaluation of large language models on multilinguality. And that was something that, unfortunately, we did not have the resources to do because people always underestimate how much work goes into making a new and good evaluation.
Yeah, I guess for the evaluations that you, maybe this is a follow-up question. So for the evaluations that you did do that sort of built off the Eleuther framework, how much do you really base your opinion on the quality of the model on those evaluations? Do you think they're totally comprehensive?
So me personally, not much. They're a signal, among other things. I think the strength of a language model like this one is going to be once people have done, applied a couple more things to it, whether it's adapter fine-tuning on instructions or whatever, how it's going to trade off accuracy on the new tasks versus biases versus what came into that. It's kind of the catch-22, right? There is no good evaluation, but you do need to evaluate what you have. I will say that the Helm folks did a really good job of it, and we were grateful that Bloom was included into that, even if it was only the base version and not the instruction fine-tune version.
Thanks.
Yacine, it's Nicole in the room again. I think one of your later slides, you talked about feedback once the model was released. And I'm wondering what your method was for collecting feedback.
So I was talking mostly about Twitter reactions, which, is not the most scientific way to evaluate people's reactions. But unfortunately, it's what drives what gets funded. So, there's that. We released the model when it was ready. And there was another 3 months before people had gotten their hand on the model and be able to evaluate it. So a lot of the early reactions were about people going to that demo that we had built and trying to get it to behave how they had gotten GPT-3 to behave and being very disappointed. And there were a couple of things going on there. One is there weren't many of the, like, again, bells and whistles. Getting a model to behave well like that depends on like the generation parameters and a lot of little things. The other thing was that people had kind of forgotten how GPT-3 behaved at the beginning. And I think the last thing there is also like, the model does well on different things. So I remember like training a lot of those cases. And as someone who had built the model, I knew how to query it, but it wasn't the same way that GPT-3 would have been. So that's kind of general comments on Twitter and in our communities, people commenting on the model, which isn't quite the same as getting the strong evaluation that we want to have.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yacine, speaking of reaction of people in general, like what people have done with the Bloom model,
yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Rail license and if you feel like that has worked.
Yeah.
Like, especially in my mind is after, like, seeing the license that Llama was released under that really didn't work for the intended purpose of like limiting distribution. Rail has a similar spirit. I'm not saying it's the same, done the same way, but I wonder, like, what's your take on it?
Okay, I'm a little self-conscious because Jen is in the room, but so for people who aren't familiar, we worked on a release scheme for the data sets, for the model that was a new kind of license. Not new in that it hadn't been done before. The Rail project has been going on and doing amazing work for the last few years. But it is the idea that you can add use case restrictions and behavioral clauses on how people are allowed to reuse your model. This was very attractive for lots of reasons. One is that, as you all know, the non-commercial definitions are a huge quagmire that no one knows how to interpret. So we don't think that was the good fit for what would be a responsible release of the model that might be used for negative purposes and negative outcomes. But instead, we wanted to say, so we as developers of the model know that you should not trust it to give you medical advice. You should not try to use it for anything that's going to be sensitive or affected people's rights. You definitely shouldn't use it to try and guess people's identities. We made the choice then to license the model and license the model weights. Whether licenses like that rely on the same processes as copyright, and there are open questions right now about whether copyright is applicable to model rights. The use agreement for Llama is a little different. First, because it's an agreement and it relies on contract law rather than licenses. But they also tried to avoid this question of what it is exactly that they were licensing and what it is that they were talking about. So the license speaks about the software, which kind of makes it hard to then go back and say, we had this vague definition of the software, and now you're resharing the weights, and that's what we don't want you to reshare. I went way too deep into that question. The answer is there's tons of open questions about how those things that we're used to as licenses in the open source world, thanks, Jen, apply or don't apply to machine learning models that are not the same beast as open source software.
Yeah. But more to, like, besides the legal answer, like, I'm curious.
Yes.
Like, you know, if basically I'm thinking, if assume Facebook had release Llama and their Rail kind of license, actually the same Rail license that Bloom used, but in 2023, when there is a frenzy of interest on this versus when Bloom came out, what is your personal opinion? Like, is that sufficient license, or should we think about something more strict there?
Right. So putting out a license gives you a tool that you can use to get people to do what you want them or don't want them to do. part of it is legal and part of it is, reputational. Like you will tell people like, clearly that's not how I wanted to use the model. So you are publicly going against my wishes as a developer. And then we get into questions of legitimacy, right? Like, is Meta legitimate for telling other people how they should use the model? Does telling people how they should be using the model, is that enough, or should they have enforcement behind it? I think having those licenses and having something that is more than documentation, that operationalizes some of the things that you think the model should and shouldn't be used, is a step in the right direction. I don't think it should be a cop-out, or I don't think it should be a full mechanism, right? You should also... so Stella from Relator had a really nice take on Twitter at some point along the lines of like, I release everything as open source because I only work on things that I think should be released. I don't think that was the case for Bloom, but we did get out of the way and decide not to go for the largest possible data set in order to have something that was less trained on things that are able to reproduce misinformation at scale or have wasted outputs at scale. It doesn't mean the model is perfect. It doesn't mean the model doesn't carry societal biases, because it absolutely does. But it also means that we feel like it's not as risky as something that you trained on just Reddit, and less likely to cause those harms. So it's like that multi-pronged approach. Jen?
So if I may, just sort of to kind of piggyback off of that, my personal opinion, where I'm sort of working this through, is I don't think currently there's any technical way that license language or contractual language can be enforced, particularly given, like Yacine mentioned earlier, there's no real, Meta with Llama, they used a software license, which wasn't really appropriate in the first place. So I think we need to get creative if we're going to start talking about enforcement and think of ways to do that. Other way, we've talked about this, like a wall of shame. Is there any way through the community, if we can get them to agree that we can make it publicly known if they go, use it outside the use case that we've made it available? But I think it would be a mistake for us to think that there's a way that we can technically enforce anything that we're putting out in the wild at this point.
And that makes me think, thank you for your answer, Jen. One of the things we're concerned about was people using the models and then deploying them in commercial services at scale that would be harmful. And corporations are notoriously worried about using things with uncleared licensing. So we thought that it was going to have kind of that chilling effect for use cases that we really didn't want to see in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the approach when it comes to licensing and related things like that. The value approach is nice, because I think there's what is possible to do with license and what it's legally enforceable, and that's a whole kind of worm, and it's akin to solving technical problems in models, and then there's what you want this model to be. So it's a nice framework to separate the two. But then my question was around it, okay, how do you apply that to the technical part of license, and then if it's satisfied that. But it's an interesting problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the answer is it does some things, but it's not a catch-all for sure.
Yacine, we're at noon, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know you have some time on the back end as well. Does anyone have any final questions before we part? And Yacine shared that he does have some time, so if you have some specific questions or wanted to have a more in-depth conversation, can maybe stick around on the meeting.
Please do, and I'm also going to take a 2-minute break if that's all right.
Absolutely, and people may drop off, but thank you so much for your time, for your work on this project, and it's been just a real treat to have you. Thank you so much.